I know that we are going to focus on center-state relations today, but I also know that before we start that, we are still going to spend time taking a look at some important issues and, of course, the continuation of our careful going through the Constitution referring to some specific articles. So after dealing with precedent between articles 52 to 62 and rest of the articles, the Constitution goes on to discuss powers and duties of the Vice President. They are there in articles 63 to 71. And obviously they talk about the qualifications to be Vice President, method of election for the Vice President, tenure of the Vice President, which is 5 years, and powers and duties of the Vice President. The point to be noted here is that the Vice President is ex officio chairperson of Rajya Sabha and delivers his functions in that capacity. Then the Constitution talks about Union Executive, and these are articles from 52 to 78. So obviously the Prime Minister, again, method of election, qualifications, powers and duties, etc., etc. That Prime Minister will be appointed by the President, and Prime Minister will then appoint Council of Ministers. Of course, he will advise and President will take that advice. Within these articles, specific articles relating to the Council of Ministers are 74 to 78. Articles 74 to 78 are about the Council of Ministers. The ones that I have already explained, basically an essence is in the principle of individual and collective leadership. Then the Constitution goes on to talk about, legislative procedures are explained in the same articles. And while the essence is there in the articles, day-to-day functioning of legislature is governed by rules of business. We have seen its outline when we discussed various kinds of motions and types of questions like star, unstarred, etc. And these provisions like the privileges and no confidence motion, cut motion, so on and so forth. Within which it is our time to pay attention to one very specific provision, that is for the quorum. Each house has a defined quorum. Quorum refers to that minimum number of legislators who are required to be present in the house for the working of the house to be held valid. That is 10% of the strength of the house. So today our parliament, Lok Sabha, has 543 seats. For Lok Sabha functioning to be held valid, minimum number of MPs who are required to be present in Lok Sabha will obviously be 55. It's corrected to the next digit. And similarly, Maharashtra Vidhan Sabha has 288 seats. For the functioning of Maharashtra Vidhan Sabha to be valid, minimum number of MLAs required to be present in the house will be 29. But the point to be noted here is that mere absence of quorum will not render the functioning of the house invalid. So quorum is defined. But imagine on a certain day 50 MPs are present in Lok Sabha and Lok Sabha transacts the business, will all that business be rendered invalid because only 50 MPs were present? So the provision says no. The answer is no. Ditto for assembly. Less than 29 MLAs present in Maharashtra Assembly and Vidhan Sabha functions will, by definition, it's also called ipso facto, by the very fact of less than 29 present in the House, will the functioning of Maharashtra Vidhan Sabha be automatically rendered invalid? The constitutional answer is no. There has to be a point of order raised by some member who is present. If no member raises any point of order that Mr. Speaker, sir or madam, we don't have the quorum, then some legislative procedure follows. What is presumed is if nobody raises an objection in form of point of order, औचित्याचा मुद्दा, if no member who is in the House raises this point of order, then the presumption is that the House has agreed to waive the provision for quorum. That is automatically presumed. But if somebody raises point of order, then of course quorum becomes applicable. Then the legislature has to follow a certain procedure which is laid down in rules of business. That is either deliberated in the House. So one choice Speaker may exercise is to ask all the members who are present, shall we proceed with the functioning? And if overall the House agrees, then the Speaker also will give the ruling that okay, now we have consciously waived the provision for quorum. But if the House does object, then either the functioning cannot go on. There is a system of warning the members. Bell rings in the campus, there is a buzzer, and it's a very standard bell that rings once every 5 minutes, and it rings 3 times, and it keeps ringing for a long time. It is like those 15 minutes that for other, it's like giving a message that either quorum is not there or something is going to be put to vote in next 15 minutes. You want to remain present in the House, here is a bell. That is like an administrative system that is followed, but the provision for quorum as originally mentioned in the Constitution was required to be brought to your notice. Similarly, the constitution of the Parliament, how will the Parliament be constituted, is explained in Articles 79 to 88. And also article numbers 330, 331 and 334. Privileges of elected members are discussed in articles number 100, 105, 106. We also discussed the disqualifications of elected representatives. They are specified at articles number 101 to 104. Now herein, articles number 101 to 4 discuss the disqualifications of elected representatives at union level. So they are about Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. Disqualifications of elected representatives at the state level are discussed in Article 191. For our careful study, the provision for disqualifications of elected representatives specified at Article 102 are important. Article 102 lays down 6 different disqualifications of elected representatives, one of which is office of profit, which we discussed, and the relevant constitutional amendment and President's use of his pocket veto, presidential veto power. We have discussed that in previous sessions. Then the Constitution goes on to discuss judiciary, lay down the provisions for judiciary. Did I tell you about Vice President? And Article 63 to 71? Okay. The articles which specify powers and duties of the Supreme Court are broadly from Article 129 to Article 147. Talks about the Supreme Court of India, within which the articles relevant for Supreme Court judges, that's very much of an issue this year. So the articles relevant for Supreme Court judges are Article 124 to 128. Therein, I would like to draw your attention to 4 types of jurisdictions for Supreme Court. There is original jurisdiction. First type is original. That such specified cases which Supreme Court and Supreme Court alone has the constitutional authority to entertain. They will lie directly to the Supreme Court. This is original. Second one is easier to understand, that is appellate. So at the most, all previous cases will be held and decided at High Court level. Then and only then the appeal will lie. Third one is writ. We have discussed that. Writ jurisdiction. Fourth one is consultative jurisdiction. I would like to say and hope that you remember that we have discussed this. If any one of you, for a moment I am also going back, but if you want to, I have done this homework for you, I hope it is for everybody's use and it helps us develop clarity. So for a moment, if you want to go back and be more clear, that's what I am doing in the light of current issues. So the criteria I have applied is the current ongoing constitutional issues and wherever the relevant articles, and our preparation will be on a more solid ground if you are aware of them. So for a moment I am going back to provisions pertaining to Parliament, because Rajya Sabha elections which just happened, and they happen once every 2 years. So the Rajya Sabha composition is discussed at Article 80 and 83. Similarly, Lok Sabha composition is discussed at Article 81, composition of Lok Sabha. Then qualifications for both Rajya Sabha and Lok Sabha are spelled out at Article 84. And then in the event of a bill or a constitutional amendment failing to pass in the upper house, that is Rajya Sabha, among various options to be exercised, one important one is a concept of joint sitting. Joint sitting. So there is a lot of, we have discussed, and I am presuming that money bills have to be introduced in Lok Sabha first and respectively Vidhan Sabha. Bills other than money bills can be introduced in either of the houses first. On bills other than constitutional amendments, Rajya Sabha has very restricted powers. That is, Rajya Sabha can at best send the bill back once. After which also Lok Sabha has these 2 or 3 alternatives, is like take Rajya Sabha suggestions into consideration, suitably modify the bill, pass it again and send it to Rajya Sabha, or choose to pass it in the same fashion and send it again to Rajya Sabha, then Rajya Sabha doesn't have authority, or it is joint sitting. But if it is constitutional amendment, then a constitutional amendment is required to be passed in both houses separately. When it comes to constitutional amendment, there is no concept of joint sitting. It's not even allowed. That is what has happened with GST and a couple of other constitutional amendments that we have recently seen. The Lokpal one during UPA regime also met with the similar kind of fate. So joint sitting is mentioned at Article 108 and 118, 108 and 118. Then after the Supreme Court, Constitution goes on to lay down the provisions for high courts. So various qualifications, powers and duties, they are spelt out between Article 214 to 230, high courts. All kinds of provisions pertaining to high courts are at Article 214 to 230. And provisions with respect to the subordinate courts. The constitutionally they are referred to as subordinate courts. They could be at district level or taluka level or very many other types of courts which have come up during the evolution of our judicial system after independence. For example, there are family courts. Sometimes there are special courts that are set up. Sometimes there is a thing called fast track courts, etc. But the provisions for subordinate courts are at article number 233 to 236. That I am now going to say brings us to the center-state relations. Basically, articles 245 to 263 discuss center-state relations. For example, what could be held as probably the most basic one is division of power between union, state and concurrent ones. Is originally mentioned at Article 246. The original mention in the Constitution is at Article 246. It's about division of powers. And the exact entries are mentioned in Schedule 7. Union government and legislature are empowered to take any decision in the national interest. So it's like overriding provision. Irrespective of what topic, at entry number what in the list, and irrespective of whether it's a state subject or concurrent or whatever, the clause for national interest, giving the power to union to take requisite decisions, is specifically mentioned at Article 249. Then residuary powers that we have seen during our capsule part, residuary, this reference to residuary power and that they lie with union is at Article 248. Union is also empowered to pass legislations regarding the state matters. a certain entry in the state list also. But union government can still do it, especially with either the consent of the state, or the state can request union to pass a requisite legislation. That is under Article 252. It's called the article pertaining to consent of the state. Similarly, the union government has all requisite power to enter into and execute international agreements. No prior sanction of the states is required. So if India is to sign an agreement with France and the French company Areva to come up with the world's largest single nuclear energy plant at Jaitapur, the Constitution specifies that union government does not need the sanction of government of state of Maharashtra. This is under Article 253, power to enter into international agreements, Article 253. Then even you won't find it difficult, hopefully with previous 16 sessions now, and now that we are heading for the conclusion, hopefully again happy conclude. Happy in the sense happy for 18, happy not because now it's going to be concluded. The happiness that you concluded. खास लोकाग्रह असतो शेवटचा आठवडा. काही सिनेमांची येते ना जाहिरात अशी. खास लोकाग्रह असतो शेवटचा आठवडा. What is expected is it is a compliment. पण त्याचा असा अर्थ जर ट्विस्ट केला की बास करा आता. म्हणून खास लोकाग्रह असतो शेवटचा आठवडा. So tomorrow we are heading for, I hope a happy conclusion in the light of all 18 sessions that we have. We have discussed that in the event of a conflict between a union law and a state law, the union law shall prevail. There is one subtle aspect of it to be now discussed. So there is no question of conflict, but think about a situation where there are inconsistencies in the union law and state law. Then of course the Constitution makes it clear that union law shall prevail. Inconsistency between union and state laws is sought to be resolved under Articles 251 and 254. Then another specific part I have already mentioned, that for an item in the state list, the state/s, that is states, more than two or more can come together and make a joint request to the union to pass the requisite law or legislation. State/s requesting union to pass requisite legislation on the entries in state list is mentioned at Article 258A. काही जणांना त्रास व्हायला लागला अशी मला भीती वाटणं चालू झालं आहे. आता हे इतकं स्पेसिफिक ना, बाकी आधी झाली आहे की खूप चर्चा, पण आता असं स्पेसिफिक की हे आहेत. States requesting the union to pass requisite legislation on the entries in the state list of Schedule 7 is under Article 258A. And as I already stated, the Constitution authorizes the center also, union also, to pass a resolution pertaining to state matter is under 258, or it's the Article 258 is the center's authority to pass legislation on matters of state. 258A defines the other way around, the states requesting the center to pass the law. I hope you are attentive towards these subtleties. There is a provision for appointment of interstate councils. I'm expecting you to especially pay attention because it's thanks to Kaveri distribution, Narmada water distribution. In fact, also the provisions pertaining to, say, Brahmaputra between, say, China, India, Bangladesh, or the Indus Water Treaty between Pakistan and India, that is 1961. So, the provision for interstate waters in the light of India's continental size and diversity in our geography, including like all kinds of small and big rivers. There is a specific mention for interstate waters under Article 262. Then there is either original mention to what are called as zonal councils. The Constitution has a provision for zonal councils. India is seen in 5 zones: East, West, North, South and Central. There is a provision for having zonal councils. So, zonal council for West Zone. Generally, this has not been used. But sometimes interstate councils can be appointed. That is under Article 263. For example, should this intractable issue of border question, Seema Prashna between Karnataka and Maharashtra, should it be sought to be solved like amicably? Then now I expect you to remember the constitutional provision that the entire constitutional power to define the boundaries of the states, okay, is with the union. So constitutionally speaking, the parliament can take it up any day and decide where Belgaum goes or Karwar region goes. So constitutional power is there. But in the light of the conflict and democratic way of trying to solve it, another way could be to conduct like referendum, ask people where they want to belong. Is a democratic practice. Or also both states jointly agreed to appoint one-man commission and also agreed in advance that whatever that one-man commission recommends will be binding on us. This was 96-97. And Mahajan commission, Mahajan was just a judge in Supreme Court. So Karnataka and Maharashtra together agreed that we will appoint a one-man commission and will abide by the recommendations of one-man commission. So that was Mahajan commission. It so happens that Mahajan commission did recommend that like more than 800 something villages which are in Karnataka are actually Marathi speaking villages. They should go to Maharashtra. And some 100 and something villages which are in Maharashtra but they are Kannada speaking villages, they should go to Karnataka. The bone of contention turned out to be Belgaum. And Mahajan commission in its wisdom decided that a line, drew an east-west line in Belgaum and said the north of that line should go to Maharashtra, south of that line should belong to Karnataka. The only point is entire city of Belgaum is south of that line. So the problem has become intractable. Then government of Maharashtra has chosen in 1995 to file an appeal to the Supreme Court, like the articles we have even referred yesterday, that either consult or go to the Supreme Court for solving these interstate. But finally, union government can also appoint a council to go into the question and then take a decision. Then as we have already seen that the 44th constitutional amendment changed the stature of right to property from fundamental right to constitutional right. So now right to property is at Article 300A. With that, I am going to now focus on the financial relations between center and state. Actually, they are the crux of center-state relationship. Therein, probably the most important part to be noted is regarding taxation powers, because that's the major source of revenue for respectively union and state governments. Articles pertaining to taxation are 265, 285, 289. I will tell you a simple rule of thumb really to understand this. The very constitution talks of 7 different types of taxes, which can be understood across 3 terms, 3 basic critical terms. One term is who has the authority to levy that tax. Center or state. Second term is who is going to collect that tax. Again, center or state. And any permutation combination is possible, please remember. They are given there in the constitution. So they together make 7 types. So there can be a tax which is levied by the center but collected by the state. There hardly is the other way around. Levied by the state but collected by the center is not there. The third term is how is that tax revenue shared? Exact constitutional word is appropriated. How is that tax revenue appropriated? The entire revenue can be retained by the union. The entire revenue can be retained by the state. Revenue can also be shared between the center and the state. So there can be a tax levied by union, collected by states, and shared between center and state. So these are 7. They turn out to be 7 combinations across these 3 permutations and combinations. Then entire money in public life, public money, so government money, every single pie has to flow into the Consolidated Fund of India. There is absolutely nothing outside the Consolidated Fund of India for union, and similarly there is Consolidated Fund of State, of course, at the state level. Consolidated funds at union and state are mentioned respectively at articles number 266 and 291. Then a very interesting element of like intelligence and flexibility within the constitution, that okay, there is consolidated fund and okay, as per the constitutional provisions, there has to be annual financial statement which has to be recognized by like both houses wherever there is bicameral legislature, and not one pie can be spent in public unless it is authorized by the elected legislature. All fine. What if emergencies come up? You can't plan earthquakes or tsunamis. You can't also plan floods. It's like in anticipation of floods, we are creating this budgetary provision. Or unfortunately, fires, etc. So many other troubles. Something happens. You can't plan subprime crisis. So how does the Constitution seek to take care of it? If sudden contingencies come up and funds are required to be allotted, moved, changed, etc., modified, etc., okay, the Constitution makes a provision for what is called as the contingency fund. Provisions for consolidated and contingency fund. I am also referring some more articles. So provisions for consolidated and contingency fund are at Article 266(7). Out of which the contingency fund at union level is at Article 266. Contingency fund at states level is at Article 267. Other articles to be remembered with respect to the financial relation between center and state are 283 and 4. (289) and 291. Within which again the distribution of revenue between union and states. How is revenue distributed between union and state? Is defined between Articles 269 to 281. Those three words I just explained, levied, collected, appropriated, are all explained between Article 269 to 281. Now the Constitution has a provision to appoint Finance Commission once every 2 years after first 2 years of the first Parliament. So the first Parliament came into existence 51-52. 2 years had to pass, and then the Finance Commission has to be appointed once every 5 years. The ongoing one is 15th. The present one that is working is 15th. Finance Commission comes up with principles like I'm expecting you to have read some little displeasure expressed by some of the states, including Kerala, today, that like chief ministers of comparatively better developed states are expressing their displeasure over the terms of reference given to the 15th Finance Commission about distribution of revenue between center and state. For example, if population is the criteria, that center's revenue will be apportioned to the states in direct proportion of the population. Then of course the states which are bigger in size and more in population are bound to receive greater amount. So the smaller states with smaller population may have every reason to complain. Then if you take into consideration GDP, the state GDP and therefore per capita GDP, if you take into consideration life expectancy, if you take into consideration literacy, and there it's the other way around, with greater literacy, lesser amount of central funds will come to the states. You will begin to see that the states who have done a better job during last 70 years and they have changed the scene of their state, so now they qualify to be called as developed states. Because of that formula, they end up by getting lesser revenue. And unfortunately, states which have made a mess during last 70 years and have allowed population to increase by leaps and by bounds and have not ensured literacy, especially female literacy, and have not provided proper health services which is under the state subject. Therefore, the average life expectancy continues less over there. Because of the formula, they end up by getting greater share in the central revenues. You will see, as I do, that the better states have reason to complain. That has appeared there today, because these are also the terms of reference for 15th Finance Commission, and as per the democracy, these discussions will go on. They are, like I already said, between 269 to 281. Then Article 275 specifies grants in aid, grant in aid, anudan, it is from union to the state. Grant in aid as an arrangement for revenue sharing between union and state is specified at Article 275. Then a very interesting part, I would like to say fascinating, also may be complex, therefore it's an intellectual challenge. I hope you pay careful attention. First of all, the Constitution lays down the power to borrow or raise loans for union and state government both. So the Constitution authorizes them to kind of borrow money or raise loans or raise money in public life, which is actually a different form of borrowing money. It's borrowing from people. It's like state or central government floats a bond and asks people to buy those bonds. Indira Vikas Patra, Kisan Vikas Patra, or Krishna Valley bonds that government of Maharashtra had issued. This is raising money for people. And in return for people buying those bonds, the government assures interest and makes such provisions. So that power to borrow or raise loans for union and state government is specified at Article 292 and 293. There is a very complex and a fascinating issue on which I intend to spend just a few minutes. The states had authority to draw extra money over and above the grant in aid mentioned in the budget. So the states could apply to central government, sorry, our treasury is vacant, the money is finished, we need some more money. And like an individual account in a bank, we are allowed for what is called as overdraft facility. It's an overdraft facility. So we have an account with the bank, or let's say we have some deposits with the bank. And for some temporary reason, we need extra money. The banks consider the track record. Banks, one has to apply. The banks will see why is that application for. And if finally the bank is convinced that it's a short-term need, that okay, this account holder may be allowed to draw more money from one's own bank account, more money than what is there in the account. That is called overdraft. Until before 1999, there was this facility for overdraft under these articles, 292, 293. So the states could ask for overdraft facility with union government. That was coordinated through Reserve Bank. And there was a very simple principle of taking care of overdrafts. So if we as individuals take overdraft from bank, then there is a duration within which we are required to return that money. And because it is a short-term credit, the interest rate is higher. These are the same principles followed if union allows overdraft for the states. It's considered as a short-term loan and a higher interest rate is charged. And from accounting point of view, this is taken care of in a rather easy fashion. So let us imagine that Maharashtra requested for an overdraft of 1,000 crore last year, the last financial year. How is it taken care of? So if interest rate is 9%, this is between reserve, it's generally around 9%. What it would mean is after using that money for a year, Maharashtra government will have to return 1,090 crores. So in the next year's union budget, the share of Maharashtra in grant in aid for the convenience of our arithmetic, let us say Maharashtra's share comes to 11,090 crore rupees. The union government only does an accounting entry that last year's overdraft is only deducted from next year's grant in aid, and the state only actually de facto receives the amount of grant in aid only after deduction. So the budgetary provision will show that Maharashtra has 11,090 crores as grant in aid from union to the state. But because last year's overdraft of 1,000 crores and an annual interest of 90 crore, 1,090 will be, by book entry, will be back into Consolidated Fund of India, and only 10,000 will flow towards Maharashtra. This is all okay from the point of view of financial discipline and all. But unfortunately, imagine, and you don't have to imagine because that's what actually happened, what if the amount of overdraft goes on increasing? Okay? So much so that your entire grant in aid will have to be deducted. That the state will not receive a single rupee from union government. That is what happened. Just before 1999, the situation had come to this pass. And don't be under the impression that this was only with respect to UP Bihar, because unfortunately, UP Bihar come to be seen as kind of sad black holes. No Indian should be happy about it. But don't be under the impression that only UP Bihar were financially mismanaged. Unfortunately, even Maharashtra was in that list. And the amount of overdraft went to such an extent that entire grant in aid by union will have to be deducted and the states would receive 0 rupees. But that's a horrible situation, because if the states don't receive that grant in aid, the states will collapse. Financially, the states will collapse. And maybe Article 360 will have to be invoked for a state. That kind of contingency is not yet foreseen. But some such, who knows, some such contingency. But there was a clamor to think about this. So the states and union governments together decided, and union government, beginning with 1999, union government took a decision. The decision was overdraft facility was withdrawn. No more overdrafts. The states were required to manage within their resources. No more overdrafts. Now, no more overdrafts would take care of possible future troubles. But what about the troubles that were already existing there? That grant in aid may be like 10,000 crores, but what you had borrowed was 20,000 crores. And why was this allowed to happen beats anybody's imagination. How could this be allowed to happen? Such a financial mismanagement. Why warnings were not issued at requisite times? But maybe that is what politics is all about. That is why the term populism is used. And last but not least also will be the political instability, like alliance government, so compromises are required to be done, blah, 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 everything. So only stopping further overdrafts is not going to solve the problem. The issue was, what do you do to the existing overdrafts? Then Union government took a decision that all overdraft amount will be converted into long-term soft loan. That was a loan for 30 years. That will be held as, legally by book entry, that will be held as a 30-year loan with like 6% interest. So since I talked about Maharashtra, let us persist with Maharashtra. And as an imaginary example, the figures are imaginary. That Maharashtra is to get like 11,090 crores. But in the previous example, the overdraft amount was 1,090, including interest. What if the overdraft amount itself was like 15,000 crores? That would mean that entire grant in aid is deducted, plus Maharashtra is required to pay like another 4,010 crores from Maharashtra revenue. That would mean आपण सगळ्यांनी भीकच मागायला पाहिजे. Raise money for the state. So the union government decision was to then turn this amount of 15,000 crores into a 30-year loan. You don't have to be mathematical genius to suddenly start seeing that, okay, each year's repayment for principal amount is now 500 crores. And the interest rate is 6%. 6% of 15,000 will be 900 crores. So 900 plus 500, 1,400 crores. Those 1,400 crores can be deducted from grant in aid because the grant in aid is approximately 11,090. That is not going to seriously affect the state finances adversely. So this major change came up. And then, of course, came up a very major and a very important law, which sooner rather than later, we'll have to study carefully. The law is called as FRBM. Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act. I'm just going to mention two things from FRBM. One is FRBM finally consolidates this cancellation of overdrafts and creates statutory principles for financial discipline at union and state levels. It lays down a limit on external borrowings. A very crucial issue, mind you. This entire crisis, called as European sovereign debt crisis, was caused because European Union, had a provision for an upper limit for external borrowings. That is called national sovereign debt, the sovereign debt. While EU Charter had the provision, the member state had followed it in breach. So as those five, essentially PIGS, P-I-I-G-S, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, Spain, suddenly woke up to the reality that their sovereign debt has crossed like 100% of GDP or 150% of GDP. The most serious, which is same as saying the funniest one, was with Greece, because Greece's sovereign debt had climbed up to 250% of their GDP. So how do you repay that loan? It's like GDP. All money that people create in a given year, that is GDP after all. Okay, pick it up and pay it as your external loan. So how should people survive? Take to yoga and breathing exercises. And at the most you can have water, and if water is scarce, draw some salt water, purify that. You won't have money to purify that and run public services and all. The country is plunged into serious trouble. Similarly, even today, please remember, even today, the sovereign debt on United States, okay, is more than the GDP of United States. So while US continues to be, काय झालं? कारण मला इकडेही आणि तिथे काही प्रॉब्लेम नाही दिसतोय. US GDP is approximately 21 trillion as of today, approximately. US sovereign debt is 24 trillion. And under US constitutional position, if there is a limit, there is a limit to sovereign debt. The president, as the chief executive, has to go to both houses every time the limit is to be increased. There is a whole history of increase of limit on sovereign debt beginning with First World War. So almost a century. Beginning with Woodrow Wilson to now literally Donald Trump a couple of days ago. President Barack Obama had to go to both houses in 2009 and 10 asking permission to increase the limit for sovereign debt. And now Donald Trump also has had to do it, and the limit is increased. But US actually having sovereign debt more than GDP is one of the factor of what is called as debt trap, that country is slipping into or walking into debt trap, कर्जाचा विळखा, debt trap. So FRBM has laid down an upper limit on external borrowings, the statutory limit binding on external borrowings as sovereign debt. That is 2/3 of GDP. That also, remember, is international norm in the field of economics also. That for the healthy economy of the country, their external debt should not exceed 2/3. I have chosen not to go into other kind of complex but fascinating details. Or I'm asking myself whether we should take 2 minutes, hoping I'm able to deal with it in 2 minutes, hoping you are at least that much of okay with arithmetic and okay with economics. Okay, imagine Greece. Think of, not imagine, 250% of GDP. Okay, what is likely to be an average amount of repayment? So are you going to say that the loans are for like 10 years? International loans generally are considered for like 10 years. Just think of it. And for our arithmetic, let us think of it. It would mean that if external loan has climbed up to 250% of GDP, okay, the minimum amount of annual repayment of the principal amount itself will be 25% of GDP. Then how much of interest? Even if it is soft loan or whatever, 2, 3, 5, 4, 6%, that will take 30%. 30% of GDP will have to be assigned for repayment of external loan alone. I hope you begin to see the seriousness. And the gravity will increase when you know that what is generally understood in economics is the answer to a very critical question. The question is, what percentage of GDP can rightfully be collected by the government in form of various taxes? Okay, so it's called GDP tax ratio. So what is an okay or optimum GDP tax ratio? That this is the GDP of the country. Out of that total GDP, what percentage government can rightly, legitimately collect in form of various taxes? The international thumb rule is 15%. 15. Many countries don't follow that. Of course, United States collect as many as 45%. And there are many other states also. Norway, Sweden, Denmark go on to collect almost 60% of GDP in form of various taxes. But like if the norm is 15, and now ask yourself again, that government is going to collect 15% in form of various taxes, but is required to pay 30% of GDP. Where are you going to bring revenue? Also think of average savings rate of an economy. Like we are around 30% today. And it's a reduced rate, mind you. It's a reduced rate. But this would mean that if repayment of external loan climbs up to about 30% of our GDP, that would eat up all our savings. Okay, that would mean no investments available within domestic market. No investments within domestic market would mean no new undertakings, which would mean no new employment opportunities, which would mean no creation of new purchasing power. So it is a vicious cycle. The economy would tumble into vicious cycle. That critical importance of the financial discipline, which is now there in FRBM. And fortunately on this account, with all our problems and in spite of all our mismanagement, we have done a good job on this front, mind you. That India's GDP is around 2.5, around slightly less than 2.5 trillion, 2,500 billion. Okay, our external loan is around 400 billion. Around, this is a very broad figure, but we are managing it within our resources very carefully. And then it may be a recent situation where external loans are more than our foreign exchange reserves. And nothing much to worry, but generally, especially after India followed LPG, all troubles were in pre-LPG times. But post 1991, we have generally maintained more foreign exchange reserves than the total amount of external loans on us. That would mean that India was in a position to finish off all external loans at one go. It's a mark of a healthy economy and a proper financial management. FRBM has now created a statutory structure for this proper financial management, and certainly most of the states under FRBM pressure has worked towards a better financial management during like last decade or so. Now we are towards the end of today's session, and I seem to have done a fairly good job today. various tribunals are mentioned, like there are administrative tribunals, etc. at Article 323. Then Hindi is held as India's official language at Article 343 and 344. All languages, including Hindi and other languages, for which generally we use the term regional, they find the mention between Articles 345 to 347. And it is under these articles that Schedule 8 is brought into existence. Schedule 8 is a list of authorized national languages there. In the original constitution, there were 14 languages. Now there are 22. As of today, there are 22. There is a very specific mention for official language of the courts, that courts will function, especially at higher level, High Court and Supreme Court. Constitution lays down that they will work in English. And the articles are 348 and 349. Functioning of High Courts and Supreme Courts will be in English. Here are a couple of last important articles to be noted. There is a provision for special areas. That is Article 371. Because of geographical, historical, cultural, or whatever reason, those have special needs. Those areas have special needs. Then the government, union or the state has the constitutional authority to take suitable steps required to address the special needs. That is all under Article 371. As a part of local self-governments, municipalities are specially mentioned at Article 243. Then there are scheduled and tribal areas. Constitutional arrangements for scheduled and tribal areas are at Article 244 and 312. And respectively, scheduled areas and tribal areas. So the relevant provisions for scheduled areas are under Article 244. The similar relevant provisions for tribal areas are under Article 312. And respectively, based on these two articles, Schedule 5 talks about enlists scheduled areas. Tribal areas are listed under Schedule 6. Schedule 6. Then apart from the states, there are union territories. Provisions pertaining to union territories are between Articles 239 to 241. My choice for the last point for the day is the 97th Constitutional Amendment pertaining to cooperative societies. This is at Article 243. The cooperative movement as a form of like Indian/Gandhian approach to development with people's participation was already foreseen right from the start of the Constitution. That found the mention at Article 243. There is an amendment at 97. The amendment continues to be controversial, but my choice is to continue that from tomorrow. On behalf of government, I express my sincere regrets for being very sharp today. I will try to improve and not commit the same mistake again. We have a rather large area to cover tomorrow. It's my test, but based on today's performance, maybe I pass that tomorrow. That is, we will be talking about some important constitutional amendments, then some landmark Supreme Court verdicts which laid down or created constitutional principles, and also broad contours of India's legal system. I know that we have huge issues. If you see the list, actually these are 3 exclusive areas. But I hope your mind has taken note of the fact that we have really dealt with many constitutional amendments as we proceeded. Also, we have seen some, if not all. Of course, all is impossible. There will have to be a year-long course only to pay attention to all Supreme Court verdicts which create constitutional cases. But in the process of our study, we have paid attention to that. But I still know that in addition to that, there are some to which I will draw your attention tomorrow. And a broad feature and some important laws and questions before India's legal system. And I do have the ambition still to be left with, like, if I may venture to say, half an hour. So I intend to, like tomorrow, I intend to finish off within first hour, leaving like 20-25 minutes if you want for like wrapping up and some of your questions. Okay? So for one last time to enjoy the capsule, we'll meet tomorrow. Prarthana karu.